At the southern end of the Caribbean archipelago lies a unique little twin island nation of about 1.4 million people. And on the larger of these two islands is a very special neighborhood that over the last century has been home to priests and politicians, massmen and murderers, artists and artisans. In November 2011, this community in Trinidad and Tobago celebrated 100 years of existence. And in commemoration of this historic time and place, some of its residents formed a committee whose purpose was to create a living document that would showcase this neighborhood's history and importance to the rest of the country, the region, the world. That document is a coffee table book titled Growing Up Woodbrook, a tapestry of then and now. And this podcast is dedicated to the men and women of Woodbrook, its sung and unsung heroes who helped turn this small community on the northwest peninsula of Trinidad into the most amazing square mile in history.
In the year 1888, Woodbrook land was a cane estate. In the year 1888, Woodbrook land was a cane estate. It was only good just for planting rice, but look at it now, it is a paradise. Oh, what a decent locality, now is the Woodbrook vicinity. Mr. Watson was the manager.
Welcome to Growing Up Woodbrook, the podcast. I'm Cecile George, Woodbrook born and raised and a member of the Woodbrook Residents Committee. And in this, our first episode, Foundation, we'll discover the earliest history of the area that became known as Woodbrook. Let's start at the very beginning.
Hello, I'm Valerie Taylor.
Valerie Taylor is a noted educator and historian and a former principal of Bishop Anstey High School.
Trinidad has a very interesting pre-Columbian history. And one of the most interesting things is the existence of Banwari man or woman. These are some remains that were found in southern Trinidad that speaks to the existence of a population in Trinidad over 6,000 years ago.
While there's some confusion about its correct Aboriginal name, there's no disputing that the island that became known as Trinidad was originally populated by the communities now called the First Peoples.
We speak about Arawaks and Caribs. However, the literature has been at pains to see that that's a really very shallow distinction.
According to Dutch cultural anthropologist Dr. Arie Boomert, there were at least 6 tribal groups who spoke languages belonging to 3 linguistic families: Arawakan, Cariban, and Warrawowan. His book, The Indigenous Peoples of Trinidad and Tobago from the First Settlers Until Today, contains a Spanish account of how the natives in the northwestern peninsula lived in 1516. The Spanish describe large, bell-shaped communal houses with closed roofs, each large enough for 100 people, and one village comprised several of these houses. The people grew ground provisions, corn, and fruit trees, and supplemented their crop by hunting, fishing, and gathering wild vegetable foods. An estimate done in the 1590s arrived at a surprisingly sizable native population.
We were told that there were about 40,000 of them living on the island, but they were a very mobile group.
The Aboriginal peoples freely moved between the South American mainland and Trinidad and the other islands. In fact, many areas of Trinidad were considered sacred to the First Peoples and were sites of pilgrimage and ceremonies to native ancestral spirits. This was the situation that Columbus stumbled upon in 1498.
Well, Columbus arrives, and what we're told is that Trinidad turned out to be one of the least attractive of the islands. It was furthest south, therefore it was the longest journey to arrive there, and the Aboriginal peoples who lived in Trinidad at the time turned out to be extremely aggressive. And also adding to that, the early questioning of the Amerindian Aboriginal peoples did not seem to show up any gold, and the Spaniards were absolutely looking for gold.
That lack of gold would determine the Spanish attitude towards Trinidad for nearly 3 more centuries.
What we have in Trinidad is an abandonment, actually. After Columbus comes in the 1490s, there are sporadic attempts to settle Trinidad, and Trinidad really did not promise much. So we have stories of the entire 16th century of Don Antonio Cedeno, Don Antonio de Berrio. I mean, there were governors like nothing who were asked to settle Trinidad and who had a lot of difficulty.
Because of fierce resistance from these original inhabitants, the Spanish found it difficult to gain a foothold on the island for most of the 16th century. In fact, the cacique, or native chief of the northwestern peninsula, a warrior named Baucunar, fortified his most important village with defense walls and united most of the natives in Trinidad in ferocious opposition to the Spanish incursion on their lands. The name of this village was Cumucurapo.
Cumucurapo, some people said that the area around Port of Spain, and that would be the flat area before we get into the hills in Northern Range, was called Concorabia. This was mentioned by Walter Raleigh, but others have subsequently said that really it was Cumucurape or Cumucurapo, and that's where we get today the name Mucurapo from, the place of the silk cotton trees.
The region known as Cumucurapo apparently extended from about where Woodford Square now stands, west to modern-day Mucurapo, from the base of the Northern Range to the Gulf of Paria. It therefore included present-day Port of Spain, Newtown, St. Clair, St. James, and, of course, Woodbrook. Baucunar and his people found the behavior and demands of the Spaniards intolerable and retaliated accordingly.
It would appear that this was the site in the 1530s of a massacre of priests when, some Spaniards pulled a fast one, landed here, and tricked some of the Indians onto their boat and ran away with them to sell them as slaves, because that is what Trinidad was being used for most of the 16th century.
So, it would appear that the earliest recorded history of the area now known as Woodbrook is as part of the strategic native village of Cumucurapo, which became the target of frequent raids by the invading Spanish for people to work as slaves in other parts of their empire. In 1592, one of the caciques granted the area around what is now called St. Joseph to the Spanish. St. Joseph remained the capital until 1783, when the last Spanish governor, Don José María Chacón, relocated the governing council known as the Cabildo to Puerta de España. Next week, we'll explore the Spanish arrival in Trinidad. What effect did it have on the indigenous people? What was happening in Trinidad and world politics in the 16th and 17th centuries? And just how did Woodbrook get its name anyway? All that and more on the next episode of Growing Up Woodbrook, the podcast.
Mr. Watson was the manager, and secondly the technical advisor.
I'm your host, Cecile George. Our podcast is a companion to the Growing Up Woodbrook Coffee Table book, jointly published by the Woodbrook Residence Committee and the National Trust of Trinidad and Tobago. The book can be purchased via the National Trust's website or from many of the fine bookstores around Port of Spain and environs.
In those designs were not in existence.
This podcast was made possible by the collaborative efforts of many people, including educator and historian Valerie Taylor, Warao Nation artist Neruki Atu Osei, and music curator Sean Randu.
But now what a decent locality is the Woodbrook vicinity.
The music in this episode was History of the Woodbrook Vicinity by the Mighty Growler and Sacred Ground by David Maracle. We invite you to join us on this exciting journey through Woodbrook's history. Subscribe and spread the word. Tell a friend or 10 about our podcast and our book. Want to ask a question or leave a comment? Click on the link in the show notes to record a voicemail. And we'll see you back here next week on Growing Up Woodbrook, the podcast.